Welcome back to those who are returning. Welcome along for those who are coming to the first time of our brief history of everything. Let me just remind us who have been together, or inform those who are joining us for the first time, what we're doing here, what we're all about. We're trying our best over 6 months, 6 sessions, to make our way through the whole Bible and sort of figure out how it all fits together. How the different people, the different events, the different places, the different storylines that happen and develop, how they are all connected to form what we generally consider to be one book. You'll have all seen, if you've been before, this is my favourite Old Testament set, where every book of the Old Testament is separated out into its own volume. And over the last 2 sessions, we made our way firstly through the book of Genesis, which wasn't much of a dent. Last session, we went through the Exodus story, which included the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this evening, our next session, we're looking at the conquest and the arrival of the kings. We're going to be in Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and Kings, and sort of Chronicles as well, which cover a lot of the same stuff as Kings, but in a different way. So that's where we're going to be this evening. And as we spent time in Genesis, we sort of encountered names and stories perhaps which are deeply familiar to us, or at the very least like things that we've heard of before. Adam and Eve in the garden, Noah and the flood, Abraham, the promises that God made to Abraham and how they developed in his life with Isaac, and through Isaac, his family, Jacob and Esau and the 12 sons, and how they ended up being down in Egypt, which is where we then picked it up in the second session, Exodus, which began with the people, the family of Abraham, having gone down into Egypt, having been fruitful and multiplied as God had commanded and as God had promised, but how in that situation they were away from home, away from God. They weren't really able to live life with God as they could or as they ought. And the Exodus story, that story of being released from pain and slavery and bondage in Egypt. Not straight through into the promised land by any means, but there was the plagues to convince Pharaoh, then there was the crossing of the Red Sea, then there was the going into the wilderness and this covenant that was made between God and the people, like a marriage of sorts, where God gives them the law and says, this is how you get to live if you are my people. If you sort of reject all of the lies of the world and recognize who you are, who I am, what life is supposed to be like. He gives them the law, he explains to them what it means to be set apart, he gives them the tabernacle, a place, a special place in which he will dwell amongst his people in a special way. There are some real brilliant episodes in the stories, like when Moses begs God to see his glory, and God takes Moses up the mountain, hides him in the cleft of the rock, passes by and reveals himself more fully to Moses. There's other incidences like God appearing to Moses and commissioning him at the burning bush, the giving of the tabernacle, as I've said, various miraculous ways in which God provides and cares for his people. But at just as many high points and wonderful things happen, there are like low points as well, where the people rebel, where the people are suspicious of God, where the people doubt whether life with God is as good as it could be if they abandoned God and went back to where they'd come from. One of the most comedic verses in the entire Bible, when they're longing to go back to Egypt because they just remember all of the cucumbers that they had there, like cucumbers by the barrel, Lord, and that's like what life is to them. The big sort of rebellion events, when Moses is up the mountain receiving the law, receiving the instruction about how life is going to be when they're living it with God, the people at the foot of the mountain decide that they're going to turn their back on God and create for themselves a golden calf. Or when they reach the edge of the promised land, they stand on the cusp of not just having God, but the fullness of what he wants for them and has prepared for them. They send out 12 spies, and the spies come back, and for the most part they say, this is not good news. God hasn't brought us here to bless us. It seems like God has brought us here to destroy us, because the people on that side of the river are monsters. And there's just rebellion after rebellion after rebellion. And the story, up until that point, has just been of them nearly being in the land. Nearly being where God had promised Abraham that his family would dwell, where he promised Moses they would dwell. And right at the end of the last session, we read about Moses dying, about Moses going up the mountain and Moses dying there. So this is where we are today. We're going to be thinking about the conquest and the rise of the kings in Israel. And we're going to be doing that by thinking about 3 specific sections of them at last going in and taking the land and settling the land and trying to live out that reality of what God has prepared and called them to follow him and to be his people in this place. See how that really doesn't ever work out in any particular way, and the kings come into power in Israel. And then we're actually going to see like 1 or 2 instances of almost heaven on earth, almost restoring Eden or fulfilling what it is that God has called them to and what God has promised them to, but how at the very highest point of all the storyline, like the deepest wounds and the biggest failures are laid bare. So that's what we're going to be looking at together. I'm going to do it starting off in Joshua chapter 1. So, would someone be willing to read for us Joshua chapter 1 and the first 9 verses? Maybe a couple of readings this evening, so let's not all be shy at the same time. Someone, 9 verses? Say yes to 9 verses now, because it could be 19 verses later. Yeah, cheers Elaine. Elaine is going to read it to us. So Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. And you'll see how this links to what has gone before. This is really just carrying on exactly where we left off. Moses leading the people out of Egypt, Moses leading the people in the wilderness, Moses dying, and then this is where we are. Joshua chapter 1. Diolch Elaine.
After the death of the Lord's servant Moses, the Lord spoke to Moses' helper, Joshua, son of Nun. He said, "My servant Moses is dead. Get ready now, you and all the people of Israel, and cross the river Jordan into the land that I am giving them. As I told Moses, I have given you and all my people the entire land that you will be marching over. Your borders will reach from the desert in the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north, from the great river Euphrates in the east, through the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. Joshua, no one will be able to defeat you as long as you live. I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will always be with you. I will never abandon you. Be determined and confident, for you will be the leader of these people as they occupy this land which I promised their ancestors. Just be determined, be confident, and make sure that you obey the whole law that my servant Moses gave you. Do not neglect any part of it, and you will succeed wherever you go. Be sure that the book of the law is always read in your worship. Study it day and night, and make sure that you obey everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Remember that I have commanded you or discouraged, for I, the Lord your God, am with you wherever you go.
Diolch, Elaine. So, before I ramble on, does anything jump out at anybody from that little section? Either developing any things that we've already seen up until this point in the story, or any sort of little lights going off, flagging up things that we know are going to come later on.
I was listening to Joshua that the law that had been given was very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And he was to carry on with his business as usual, as far as God is concerned. Moses had gone, but Joshua was to take that responsibility and to be courageous, bold, but also observant of the law.
Mm. So there's like a really deliberate statement of discontinuity. It's really blunt and harsh. Moses is dead, so let's carry on, which sort of doesn't really feel fitting enough for the way that God had used him and how important he was, although if you read the end of Deuteronomy there's sort of fitting tribute there. But at the same time, it is a really striking statement of continuity. Like, just because Moses is gone, it doesn't mean that I'm finished with that. When you think about it, they are now going into the fullness of everything that was being discussed, described, promised in the law. Again, we can have this view of the law as being rules and regulations which restrict us, but that's a really wrong way of looking at it in its fullest form. Of course, there are things that we're told to abstain from, things that are outlawed and banned, but it's this description of what life gets to be when it's lived with God. You think of the do not murder. You could say, oh, God is spoiling my fun, I want to go around murdering everyone. But the reality is the law is there describing, well, if you're my people, if you live with me, if you live in my place, if you're trusted in me, you don't need to go around murdering. You don't need to go around taking lives. You don't need to go around stealing, robbing, lying about one another, trying to get one over on each other, trying to push others down to pick yourselves up. So he's saying, there's continuity there, exactly, that they are carrying on with this and they're about to go into the fullness of that and get to experience that in a fuller way. Anything else stand out for anybody? Yes, indeed. So that is verse 9. And yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so there's a little bit of calling back there. You can go look back in your history. This is the God I have been. I've been with you the whole last 40 years. You've been wandering in the wilderness. I was with you when I took you through the Red Sea. I'm a God who is with you. But that for me really rings bells with what Jesus says at the Great Commission, because we're thinking about how this all fits together, not just how it's building and what's gone before. When we get to Jesus in our final session, that's going to be something we can flag up, isn't it? That Jesus says to his followers, I will be with you even to the very end of the age. That's not, in a sense, a new promise. That's like how God has always spoken to his people. Go. Well, it's more than just the promise to be with you, isn't it? It's go, fill this place. Jesus says, go to the ends of the earth and I will be with you in doing that. I just think that's really cool. Anything else?
Continuation of the journey.
Okay, yeah. It's a little bit of a fleshing out for us as well of the promise that has already been given several times to Abraham and his descendants and to Moses at the start in the book of Exodus, saying that not just is he going to well, you know, we can think of the promises to Abraham, not that he's just going to give him a family, a descendant, but he's going to give a place where they dwell with him. And the Israelites, it's not just setting them free from something, but it's taking them and putting them somewhere special. And that should even tie back in with our thinking, with all the way back to the very start of Genesis. What is it that we see? It's God with people in a place, and the consequences of the fall is that they are shut out from that place, and in so doing they are shut out in a certain sense from the presence of God and the blessings of God. So all of these promises are like the reversal of the curse and what has gone wrong. So it should make sense to us, actually, just like if they were in the garden with God in the beginning, and then the punishment was being kicked out of the garden and kicked out of that relationship with God, then part of what God is promising to do is to say, well, no, I'm going to renew and refresh that relationship. And we should expect it to be in a particular, for a place to be a part of it. Let me put it like that. I think that's probably a better way of putting it. So there's loads of things linking up now about where the people are, and that's throughout the stories in Genesis, that's throughout the Exodus as they're wandering and waiting to get to this spot. It's what is about to come here. And again, think to what Jesus says. He tells us to go and to fill the earth with his presence. And actually, where the church is, God is. And not just like in an ethereal sense of, or these are the words we use to describe it, but like literally, wherever we are, whether we gather, wherever we are sent by God, that place then has the presence of God in a way that it doesn't when we're not there. So that's, another bit of how it's all linking together. Okay, so, yeah.
Verse 3, the entire land that you'll be marching over, that's Canaan, then, is it? That is the destination.
Yes, exactly. So this is going to be on the other side of the Jordan, and what we understand to be Israel. And notice it actually gives some of the boundaries of it as well, saying it's this place from here to there, from there to here. You know, like if we were going to describe where Wales is, we'd say, you know, all the land from the Irish Sea to, is it Offa's Dyke or whatever, that's the boundary, all the way from north down to Bristol Channel, as far as the eye can see, that is Wales. You know, so there's a description of the patch where it's going to be, what bounds it in.
Sammy also, he gives us tools, he equips us, doesn't he? Verse 8, he says, meditate on his laws, on the book, will make it prosperous. He gives us the Bible, he gives us tools to enable us to live our lives.
Yeah.
You know, which is, just doesn't leave us, you know, if we follow the rules, which is a good thing, because you've got his best interest for us, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything that we need
Yeah.
to prosperous. But we don't do it half the time, you know, so we can be very prosperous if I meditated on the book.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way of describing it as well, isn't it, to meditate on my law. In my version here it says, the book of instruction must not depart from your mouth as you meditate on it day and night. You know, it's supposed to fill what your speech and your hearing and your thinking and what have you. And that's another sense in which it's more than just, here are these bare naked laws, do or don't, but they speak of the entire quality and manner of life lived with God.
People say he puts these laws, but if he was on a hilltop, he said if you do these, it's going to be better for
Yeah.
you, and you're going to prosper, you know.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Isn't there also warnings in here that there are battles ahead, which is what you alluded to anyway earlier on. There are battles ahead. I've led you here to the promised land. Get prepared to cross through the Jordan. As Sammy said, there's some nasty people on the other side, not God's people, unrighteous people. There are battles ahead. So twice it says be strong and courageous, but it's contingent on God's people following the law.
Mm.
You know, follow the law, listen to my word, follow me, and be strong and courageous. And we know, because we kind of know what's going to happen, don't we, that the Lord will settle them in this land. And there will be amazing scenes ahead, amazing miracles ahead, you know, like, was it 30,000 down to 3,000 men who defeated the enemy? All those things are ahead, but it seems to me that it's so strongly emphasized, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, you should meditate it. Be careful to do what's written in it, then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. But that's not what happens, is it? We're going to fall again. So
well, indeed, let's not try and anticipate everything, otherwise, you know, we'll wrap it up now and we'll go. But to say, okay, that's an interesting detail to pick up on. It's not going to be easy. To be told that you need to be strong and courageous suggests that there's going to be hardship ahead, that there is going to be, well, very real temptation to shrink back, as they already did when they spied out the land for the first time. But yeah, it begs the question, doesn't it? Where is that strength? Where is that courage to come from? And it's not instructing them just to become hard as nails, you know, I'm dead inside and I can go into war and I can experience everything and, you know, you're never going to take me down. That's not what God is instructing them. But as you say, it's looking to him. It's leaning on him. It's leaning further and deeper into him, which will yield strength and courage to endure what lies ahead in the midst of all of the blessings, all of the trials and all of the hardships that are ahead as well. Oh, it was a heck of a lot more than that. Heck of a lot more. More than what we've even got in our scriptures as well. We've just got like a fraction of what was given. You were here last time when we were looking at, and it was just a small throwaway comment, but basically the book of Deuteronomy is Moses reiterating virtually everything to the generation that had grown up in the wilderness, who hadn't been there when the law was first given. So he's reiterating it to them and saying, look, this is what God commanded us. But the time scales involved in what it says in Deuteronomy, you know, he's there from morning until night, really do show to us that he must have said more than what we've got recorded, because we could just read it and say it in a much shorter time frame. And as well, I mean, this is a larger point, but it's worth saying now, when we speak about the law, or when the Bible speaks about the law, it isn't speaking simply of like the legal code. That's our modern way of understanding the word law, and it's certainly including the legal code. But the Bible refers to the first 5 books as the law, but the law isn't given in Genesis. It's only given partway through Exodus. The law is, you know, what I was trying to say over in this direction. It's the story and the reality of living with God and following God. So there's law, there's, another way of translating the word isn't law, it's instruction. Follow my instruction. And what we learn from how people and God interact. And some of that is literally the do's and the do nots and the how-tos. But it's more than that as well, yeah. The tabernacle, yeah. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because part of the gift of what God had given them in the wilderness was the tabernacle, and the special way in which he was going to be present there amongst them. So we understand that God is like everywhere, always, anyway. But the Bible isn't shy about speaking about, at certain times, in certain places, in certain ways, God is present in a particular way. Whether that's just like the sense in which we're able to experience him or acknowledge him and relate to him or what have you. And so one of the gifts he gives them is the tabernacle and says, look, I'm going to dwell there in the midst of you. Arrange your tents all around it, facing inwards, so that you know, there I am with you. Your whole society, in that setup in the wilderness was based where God was at the center and all of them orbited And what brought them together was this thing in the middle, the tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, the ark, and God's presence there as well. Right. That was longer than I anticipated on the first 9 verses. But never mind, we'll keep going. So this is the start then of the conquest. They're there, Moses has died. Moses, along with that generation who rejected God, were not permitted to enter the promised land. They've all died away, save a handful, including Joshua, including Caleb, who were the 2 spies who went and said, no, come on, forget how big these boys are. We can go. God has told us we should take this land. So they're permitted to go in. Again, chapter 2 of Joshua, they send in spies. They find this place called Jericho. That's going to be where God sends them first of all to take some ground. But chapter 3 is a really significant story, and it's one of these things that seem to keep on repeating themselves in the scriptures, is that when something special is happening, people pass through water. So does somebody want to read chapter 3, verse 9 down to, I've got 17, I think that means the end of the chapter, yeah, verse 9 down to 17. Chapter 3, verse 9 down to 17. Anybody? Yeah, Becky? Diolch.
Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and he will certainly drive out before you Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand in a heap." So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage or during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away, the town called Adam, in the vicinity of Zarephath. And while the water flowing down to the sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground.
So this is them now actually crossing the Jordan and going into this promised land, the land that is occupied by all these people. But they do it in a pretty miraculous way. You know, they could have found a shallow enough patch to wade across. It wasn't like an impassable river by any stretch of the imagination. But God says, no, we're going to do it in this particular way. These group of people are going to take the ark, they're going to stand there, then everyone else is going to walk through on dry land, and then they're going to come out, and then the water's going to cover back over and flow again through the river. And so I ask the question again, does this ring any bells? Is anything kind of either that has been before or that will be again in the future?
It's like a lovely symmetry, isn't it? From the Egyptians and the water going back in there. They've been through the wilderness and they're coming out of it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. It bears looking into. I can't remember what the significance of that is. We've preached through Joshua, myself and Jonathan, many moons ago. I think we might even still have been in the school when we preached through that. But I don't remember the significance of that. I apologise. But you're right. And for anybody who didn't hear, Gerald was saying, you know, the Exodus story began in one sense with them passing through the waters of the Red Sea. Like literally the flowing water standing up on either side of them and then passing through on dry land. And now the Exodus story is finishing with them passing through the waters, which is pretty cool. But you could look at, in one sense, the story of Noah in the ark, that, you know, he's surrounded by water, but God keeps him and his family and the animals on the ark with him safe and dry. You could even look all the way back to creation. Creation is described as like great waters above and below being separated, or the land coming up out of the waters, and that's where God puts us, on the dryness in the midst of all of those waters. So again, there's this sort of theme idea. God is at work. God is doing something special to rescue or to bless his people, and he does that by keeping them safe in the midst of waters. Looking forward, any stories of water to come? Yes, Suzanne nods. Yes, there are. Yeah. So they all headed out into the wilderness to see John, and then passed through the waters of the Jordan, literally, in baptism. And Jesus does that at the start of his ministry. And, well, yes, he spends time in the wilderness as well. There's various symbolisms there as well. Yeah, they cross over, cross through. There's, Jonah, interesting. I'm just trying to think now how we might tie that in, yeah.
Because Jonah's a sea, there's a big sea somewhere.
But you get the point though, and this is one of the things that I want us to do as we're working our way through, is to see that there are these things in scriptures that are deliberately there to help us link together all. These aren't isolated stories that just happen to have been written down in one particular culture's history and passed on, or what have you. These are things which are connected. These are part of the same story of how God is rescuing, how God is restoring what has gone astray. If you like, it's a little bit like David Walliams' books. Have you ever noticed how David Walliams titles all of his books? They were to begin with anyway, always titled with like a familial link. So, Gangster Granny, or Grandad's Great Escape, or I'm showing. Does anybody know any more of the names of David Walliams' books? There's like first 5 or 6 all had about a relative's name and then some adjective describing them or noun describing them. So you could pretty much, you just be told the name of a book and you're like, all right, yeah, this is David Walliams writing, in that sort of style, because that's the author's fingerprints on it. And it's the same in scripture. When God is involved, he seems to do things in these similar ways, repeating ways that you're like, oh yeah, this really feels like a God thing to do because I know how he's done it before. And that's part of what faith is, like being able to look back at how God has interacted, how God has acted, and to trust and to hope that he will bear the same sort of thing again in the future. Okay, so Joshua, now he's led the people through the water, but by no means is the land taken. As David over here pointed out, they need to be strong, they need to be courageous, there are hard times ahead. And if I can sum up the whole of the book of Joshua really quickly, that is basically, it's the story of them head-on encountering the hardship and the reality of taking possession of this land. Part of what God is doing is using these people, going in and blessing them, to judge the people who are there. Just like later on in the story of Israel, they're going to go off into exile. God is using other people to judge them for their sins as well. So part of this is about judging the nations who have utterly rejected him, who live in this place. But it's also about God giving it over to them. And story after story of them taking towns and defeating peoples is told, or they are told in such a way to reinforce to us that it really is only by God's involvement and God's strength that they make any ground. The very first one is the story of the conquest of Jericho, chapter 6. we've got quite a lot to get through, so I'm not necessarily going to get us to read a portion, but does anybody know, like how do we know that this was like a victory through God, not just by the people's own might and intelligence? Do we know the story of conquering Jericho? Yeah. They spent 7 days. No. They spent 7 days blowing trumpets, not blowing trumpets, and marching and this and that and the other. There's no like tactics, elements of surprise or what have you. And then the walls just collapse on their own by God. And it's, the very first victory, undeniably God. And there are a few occasions where they don't heed God's warning. They don't listen to him in terms of following his ways. And the result is death. When they do rely more on their own understanding, when they do what Eve did, saw that the fruit was good in her own eye and took it and enjoyed it, or Sarah and Abraham did and saw that Hagar, was good for producing offspring, so took her and used her, and so on and so forth. There's a couple of occasions where the people do that and it leads them to death. But over and over again, the stories are here, Jericho. There's a story, I think it's chapter 10, where they're in this great battle and they pray out, Lord, make it basically be day for a long time so that we can keep on fighting this battle and win the victory. And that's exactly what happens. The sky stops. The sun and the moon stop where they are, and it is day for a prolonged length of time. And, there's no explanation for it except that God was involved. And so we have these stories of conquest, of battle, sometimes of defeat, but ultimately of victory. And they're supposed to help us to see that when we are following God, when we're trusting in God, when we're leaning on him, when our strength and our courage comes from him, then there is life. But when we reject him, when we go our own way, when we do what's right in our own eyes, ultimately we find nothing but death. And if you just, if you've got your Bibles open in front of you, flick through, you'll see that the next couple of chapters along, 13, 14, 15, they are all descriptions then of who it is who gets to go into what places. It's a description of how this land then is given, is allotted to the various segments, tribes of Abraham's descendants, of Israel's children. Who gets to live where? It's a description, like of Christmas morning, when the kids come down and they find their present with their name written on it. This is where you're going to live. This is where you're going to live. This is where you're going to live. And in a sense then, it should be really exciting. Okay, is this what it's all been building up to? The people, through extreme hardship in Egypt, through the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows of the wilderness wanderings, through the hard blood, sweat, tears and prayers of going into the land and dispossessing the people who were there, to finally receiving this place where they can trust in God, where they can lean on God, where they can teach their future generations what it is to live with Yahweh, to know God, to fear God, to walk with him, to enjoy him. Is this going to be, the fullness of that? And you get towards the end of Joshua, and there's this sense where, actually, maybe it isn't paradise regained. One of the stories we passed over in Pun Not Intended, when we were doing the last session, was of a few of the tribes on the wrong side, shall we say, of the Jordan, saying, look, we're well into we're well into coming across the Jordan and helping you guys take possession of it. But actually the land that we found here already seems good enough to us. It seems, plentiful, it seems abundant. So let's say this, we'll take this land now, before we go over the Jordan. Don't you worry about it. When it's time to go over and fight, we'll come with you and fight. But when all is said and done, we'll retreat back to this patch of land that, can be ours on this side of the Jordan. And in the story, God is gracious, God is merciful, and he says, if that's what they want, let them have it. And towards the end now, see chapter 22 speaks about those tribes going back across the Jordan, going back out to the promised land to where they'd wanted to go. And, in a sense, you just think, well, that's fine. God's approved it. God said it's okay for them to live somewhere else. But it should sort of leave us disappointed that God has, life in store for people. And even in the midst of that, they've been sort of scheming and planning how they're going to exist without him. The end of the book of Joshua, turn over the page again, just like Moses had his farewell address, chapter 23, chapter 24, Joshua's farewell address. He knows that he's his description is, I'm about to go the way of all the world, I'm about to die. And he can foresee that these people, just like the generations before, are going to struggle to stay faithful to God. That the temptation will be too strong. The dissatisfaction inside all of us is going to agitate too much, that they're going to rebel in some way, shape or form. And he lays it on the line. He said, look, I'll remind you of everything that God has done. I'll remind you of all the wonderful victories that he's achieved on our behalves, from Egypt to here to now. And then in chapter 24, verse 15, he kind of gives them this ultimatum, sort of. He said, if it doesn't please you to worship the Lord, then choose for yourselves today. Which will you worship? The gods your fathers worshipped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living? As for me, my family, we will worship the Lord. He's saying, look, I can't be here much longer to lead you. I can't be here much longer, to keep the spiritual level up here, keep everyone's attention on Yahweh, the true Lord of our ancestors. One final speech, I'm going to remind you of who he is and why he's better, and why living with him and for him and beneath him is so much better. But ultimately, it's going to come down to you. Do you want to stick with him, or do you just want to, prostitute yourself out to whichever local lowly deity you come across? And the people with one voice, we will certainly not abandon the Lord to worship other gods. For they know, don't they, God has brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt, out of that place of slavery. He's performed all of these great signs before our eyes. He's protected us all along the way among all the peoples whose lands we've travelled through. They recount, that God is the one who's driven out these people. None of the victories we've won have been through our own might and strength. It's God who's done it. We too will worship the Lord because he is God. Oh, wow. Sounds right then, doesn't it? They've doubled down, recommitting to the commitments that they've already made. Verse 19, but Joshua told the people, you will not be able to worship the Lord because he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions and your sins. If you abandon the Lord and worship foreign gods, he will turn against you, harm you, completely destroy you after he's been so good to you. He honestly doesn't think that they're up to it. And that's pretty much how it finishes. Joshua dies. The chief priest dies. The people are there. They're in the land, or most of them are in the land. They seem like they want to follow God and to enjoy him as they are created and called to do. They're leaders. apparently didn't think that was necessarily a foregone conclusion. We turn the page over, the book of Judges. And, well, does anybody know anything about the book of Judges? It's the first book of the Old Testament I preached through on my own after Jonathan had abandoned us and gone over to Abergavenny. So I feel like I know it reasonably well.
The worst of humankind is just everything in there. When I first read Judges, I realised that everything that I've been turning over in the news in my life as a journalist has all been done before.
Yeah. So within Judges, within the book of Judges, there are these cycles of sin and rebellion and repentance and sin and rebellion and repentance and sin and rebellion. And the way that they're arranged in Judges, like the sin and the rebellion just gets deeper and darker and worse. And the consequences of wandering away from God gets harder and longer each and every time. And so within the book of Judges, there's this like repeating pattern, this repeating history. But David, you're exactly right. It's really just the repeated nature of all of human history, of just finding new names really and new opportunities to do the most awful thing to one another and to manifest our rebellion, our rejection of God. So the book of Judges is all about how the people aren't united in this place. That was hinted to really when some of the people didn't stay on that side of the river. Some of the tribes went back across the river, didn't want to be a part of it. But it's from the word go. A little bit of work that's been left to be done, that some of those places that have been promised still needed folks to go and to fight and to capture. And from chapter 1 onwards, there's just failure to listen to God, to obey God, to trust in him, to do the things that he calls them to do. And consequences, like real consequences. As if we'd have looked at some of the stories, like the sin of Achan, like of various battles that they went into in Joshua, but they didn't go at the Lord's leading, it was just their own opinion, that when people go their own way, it leads them to death. And when they don't listen to what God has commanded them to do, time and time again, there's stories of suffering, that other people rise up and lord power and authority and sway and influence over them, and their life is less because of it. Instead of having, they think, we won't do what God says, we'll do what we say. Instead of having, they end up having not. Or what they have is just problems and sorrow and suffering and sadness. I've written down here, Judges chapter 1, verse 1. Yeah.
Sorry, in my Bible it says the history of Israel in the times of the 14 judges.
Right.
So that was the main thing you were saying.
So in the whole book of Judges then, certain individuals are named as judges. So they don't have kings. Kings have been outlawed in the law, the legal code given to Moses, although actually in Deuteronomy, there's also a description about what they're supposed to do when, predictably, they reject God and demand a king. It's amazing that when God is in the midst of telling them, don't do this, but when you don't listen to me, so that it doesn't go really bad for you, this is the sort of king that you should choose for yourselves. And in the book of Judges, did you say 14? Yeah, so 14 people are named. One of the things you see is that they're in specific places. So that's another thing of the disunity that exists. That people and tribes in specific places at different times accept God, go to him, reject God, suffer punishment, cry out to God, and leaders are raised up. Some of them, famous stories, again, that we may know very well. We may know only in part, Probably the funnest story for little boys is in chapter 3, Ehud. Ehud and King Eglon. Eglon is extremely fat, and he gets murdered when he's on the toilet. And he's so fat that when he gets stabbed in the stomach, the sword disappears and his bowels fall out, whether that means his intestines or whether it means he poops himself, It's not a nice story, but it is the sort of story that little boys will go, "Ooh, that's cool." But not particularly a famous individual. But you've got perhaps famous to some folks, Deborah, chapter 4, a woman who is raised up to judge and to lead the people. Barak, who is her commander in the army, who goes in to fight the battle. Jael, a woman, a Gentile, who actually is the one who kills the bad guy in the story. You've got later on the story of Gideon, which I think you were alluding to earlier, David, when you said about not that many soldiers, but the vast number of soldiers is whittled down so that once again it would be beyond doubt that it was God that had given them the victory. That is, they cried out to God. Midian is oppressing the people. They can't eat. They can't care for themselves. They're not supposed to have weapons or anything like this. It's a scene, like they say, probably quite rightly, it would have been better if we'd have stayed in Egypt than to find ourselves in this situation. And God rescues them. And Gideon is the name of the leader in that situation. Samson, another famous story. He's one of the judges. Is actually a pretty cool story which links in with a few things. Samson's story begins in chapter 13, and it begins with a family, a wife and a husband. They're not able to have children, and the angel of the Lord comes, appears to them and says, I know that you can't have children, but this is what's going to happen. You are going to have a son. You are going to have a special son. You're going to make a promise on his behalf that he will be a Nazirite, something from the law, about how they are, if you like, extra given to God, even though they aren't priests. They're not supposed to be able to serve because you have to be a descendant of Aaron to serve. These are people who give themselves over in that sense. And Samson is born. Samson does his business, he's got his super strength, he's got Delilah, and he ends up dying as he crushes the enemy as well, which, if you're looking for echoes and symbolism and links, it's abounding. And all the way through, every time someone rises up, you're thinking, okay, well, God did promise that there was going to be a serpent crusher, didn't he? And God did promise to Abraham that his seed, singular, one of his descendants, was going to be someone who was going to do something which was going to bless not just the people of Israel, not just the children of Abraham, but all the peoples of the earth. So sort of every time you think, is this going to be the one? Is this going to be the one? And in a miniature way, they are often the one, because they do defeat the enemy of God. They do defeat the enemy of God's people. They do bring light and life and relief. But more often than not, they in themselves bring with it their own version of misery and pain. Go away and read the story of Gideon. Gideon is great because God uses him to defeat the Midianites. But in a sense, the end of the story is even worse than the start, because he leads them in total and utter rejection of God, basically. Total and utter idolatry, and it's terrible. Culminates all of this downward spiral over and over again in chapter 19. chapter 19, and an incident which sparks basically civil war. It's not a passage you are going to choose for an all-age service. A woman is abused, she's murdered. Somehow, in order to try and find justice for her, this guy thinks it's a good idea to chop her up and to send her to the distant corners of the nation. And everyone who casts an eye over the events of chapter 19 understands that things have gotten like way too out of hand. And so basically all of the tribes commit to putting it right, commit to killing their brothers, commit to seeking retribution, justice, vengeance. I don't know, there's lots of different words that you could use to describe it. And there's just death abounds. Isn't it? Always, whenever people wander away from God, death enters in. And when they sort of seek to address it in their own ways, I'm the one who can fix this, I'm the one who can put this right, death multiplies. It actually makes what Jesus has done like all the more amazing, all the more profound, all the more wonderful, that through his death, death is multiplied. Through his death, life is birthed. And life is what goes out. It's savage. I mean, there's so much death that this one tribe basically has no hope of continuing. You know, be fruitful and multiply. Multiply will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the shores of the seas. And there's this one tribe that has just been obliterated, decimated. And so they set it up so that basically they, for a while, will overlook people kidnapping wives for themselves. Chapter 21, they have this whole scheme where, actually now to try and, go back into that place of abundance and fruitfulness and a growing population, they say, it's okay. Let me see, chapter 21, verse 6. Israelites had compassion on their brothers, the Benjamites, and said, "Today a tribe has been cut off from Israel. What should we do about wives for the survivors? We've sworn to the Lord not to give any of our own daughters as wives." So they hatched this plan to go down to a particular place, to kill all of their men. They found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not gone to bed with a man, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh in the land of Canaan, and they basically said, "Have your fill with those." And it's just madness. It's hard to imagine that any culture will have read. There's sometimes we can think, we're the developed, we're the moral people, we've got our universal human rights declared and laws and all of this. It's hard to imagine any culture that ever would have read this and gone, right, okay, this seems like a decent way of sorting things out. Certainly nobody who had been reading the story so far and what God had instructed, what God had called them into, would say, yeah, they're walking the God path daily. And the book ends with an amazing verse. Chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did whatever seemed right to him. Do you know, and actually, I know we're about to coronate a king, but that's sort of the spirit of our age, isn't it? Where you do you. And we sort of put the caveat on it, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. But everything we do has an impact on someone else. That's like one of the worst lies our culture has sold us, is that we can be independent, that we can be cut off from everyone else. Or that even if I harm one of you, that's just something between me and you. But that's not the reality, is it? When we sin, even when we sin against ourselves and no one else, like pain and death goes out through that. It impacts, it affects. A really obvious version of that is people with serious addictions, isn't it? And it doesn't just hurt them. It hurts everyone around them. And not that that's like an intentional thing, I'm not saying, but what a world for them to be living in. They've crossed over, they're in the promised land. They went down, it was like Christmas morning, all of these places God has, stick to the law, because there you'll find life and abundance, and I've given it to you all, I've explained to you, you've got me, you don't need to be worried, you don't need to be scared, you don't need to trod on anybody else, you don't need to abuse anybody else, because you've got me, and you've got life when you follow me. And now, there's no king, and that includes God is not their king, and everyone does what seems right to him, and it's just chaos. That's just a description of sin. In the garden, Eve did what seemed right to her, and every time we see it, it's someone just doing what seems right to them. Multiplies. But there is a little, let me lean, okay, quickly. So that's taking and settling. We'll go much quicker through the next two, I promise you. But there's just a little breadcrumb of what's going to come next. There was no king, I've said, no king including God. But you might think, of course there's no king. They're not supposed to have a king. God is their king, These people are specifically called judges, not kings, because they're not given like that kingly rule and authority. They're just called for a season, for a purpose, to galvanize the people and to lead the people to restore them. So it's interesting that this description of a king would be given at the end there. In the midst of all of that, we have the story of Ruth and Boaz. Story of Ruth and Boaz, chapter 1, verse 1 says this: during the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. And actually, if you've read through the book of Judges, you can well imagine that there would be a famine in the land, because the people are always turning their back on God. And God has said, if you turn your back on me, it's not going to go well for you. But if you turn back again and seek me, then I will save you, I will rescue you. So it's the time of Judges, there's a famine in the land. Obviously the people have rejected him, rebelled against him, something's going on. But it's the story of this woman, Naomi, and her family who leave Israel. They go off to Moab, who was one of the nations that they passed through on the way to the promised land, that they'd had friction with, shall we say, on the way to the promised land. They think that they're going to find life there. Guess what? Anybody guess? They think that they're going to find life by leaving God. They find death. Yeah, it says really quickly, they entered the fields of Moab, they settled there. Verse 3, Naomi's husband Elimelech died. She was left with her 2 sons. Well, they got for themselves wives, one named Orpah, one named Ruth. But after they'd lived there for 10 years, those 2 sons died. And now you've got 3 women who, culturally speaking, are totally and utterly destitute. So it's the story of Naomi and Ruth, this Moabite who is faithful to her mother-in-law but finds faith in God. They return home. They seek God in Bethlehem, the house of bread. She meets this dude called Boaz who's going to do whatever it takes to rescue her, to rescue Naomi, to carry on the name, to save the land. All of these sort of ideas and themes that have been developed so far in the scriptures. They get married, they have kids, But will somebody read, it's a bit strange, this love story between the two of them. Will somebody read chapter 4 of Ruth, verses 13 down towards the end? Not towards the end, to the end. Anybody? Thank you, Malcolm. Ruth chapter 4, verse 13.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without the next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. Your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. And the women of the neighbourhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They called him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nashon of Solomon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David.
It's a really weird handbrake turn in this 4-chapter story of God's providence, God's sovereignty, of love developing, of rescue, of salvation, of faith in God, to all of a sudden just go, oh, and by the way, their grandson was Jesse. And do you know whose son Jesse turned out? What famous son Jesse had? David. You're like, oh, what's going on here? Why are you telling me about that? Because it's all leading towards the rise of kings in Israel. So you turn the page over again, and we're into 1 and 2 Samuel. As we said in the first session, these are one and the same book, but they've been divided up because it's a very long book, and the scriptures used to be primarily kept on scrolls, and after a certain length, scrolls became unwieldy and unpractical to use, so they used to chop them up in 2. So 1 and 2 Samuel is really just one book, and it's the story of how, if you like, the very final judge, a guy called Samuel, hands the reins over to kings in Israel. So Samuel himself is an interesting enough character. He comes about miraculously, as so many significant individuals in the scriptures do. His mother is unable to have children. That's chapter 1. His father's other wife, just gloss over that. He's got 2 wives. She can have kids, and she's always being nasty to Hannah, Samuel's mother. So she goes to the temple, she prays, she asks God to vindicate her, basically. And God answers her prayer, gives her Samuel, and she gives Samuel back to God. She hands Samuel over at an appropriate age to go and live and serve in the temple. And Samuel grows up under the tutelage of Eli, who is the high priest at the time. Eli and his family, they're not particularly devout people, if I could put it that way. His sons especially are scoundrels, and God has made a separate judgment saying, you all aren't going to carry on being my representatives. I'm not going to accept you representing the people in the way that priests do, standing in that gap between God and people. But he actually calls to Samuel. And 1 Samuel chapter 3 is the story of Samuel sleeping in the temple, and he hears God calling out to him. What does it say? Chapter 3, verse 1. I'll just read little bits of it. The boy Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence, and in those days the word of the Lord was rare, and prophetic visions were not widespread. That doesn't sound like a very good relationship, is it? It's like we don't talk anymore, God and the people. There's no real relationship between them. One day Eli, whose eyesight was failing, was lying in his usual place before the lamp of God had gone out. Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was located, and the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me," because he thinks the voice that he hears is Eli calling him in the night. "No," says Eli, "it wasn't me," goes back to bed. But again, verse 6, once again the Lord called, "Samuel." Samuel got up, went to Eli and said, "I'm here, you called me." And he says, "I didn't call you, go back and lie down." Now Samuel, it says, did not yet know the Lord, because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So he's serving in the temple, but he's just, I guess, just going through the motions or just doing what he's told. Once again, for the third time, the Lord called Samuel. He got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Now, on the third occasion, Eli understood that it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say to him, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and he lay down, and the Lord stood there and called as before. As I mentioned it, the Lord stood there and called before. This is not just some disembodied voice. This is God coming to meet with him. "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel responded, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And then God reveals to him what's going to happen to Eli's family, that he's going to judge them, that he's going to cut them off. But it's the beginning of the relationship between Samuel and the Lord, and Samuel being God's voice, God's representative, God's prophet, God's priest, God's judge there amongst the people. If you scan down to the end of the chapter, it says this, verse 19, "Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and he fulfilled everything Samuel prophesied. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a confirmed prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear in Shiloh," that's where the tabernacle was before the ark was moved to Jerusalem, and they built the temple there, by the way, "because there he revealed himself to Samuel by his word, and all Samuel's words came to all of Israel." So now we've got God speaking through this person, God leading, and you think, well, it's been a pretty dire couple of decades, really, with this spiralling of sin, with individuals rising up and infighting, disunity amongst the people rejecting and rebelling against God. But now we've got this miracle boy. God's given him, God's revealed himself to him, God is using him and is at work through him, and everybody knows that he represents God before them. So perhaps this is what we're after. This is the one. At last, good times ahead. No. The people don't really particularly listen to Samuel. Samuel's own family go off the rails. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, it's sad for Samuel, but it's more sad for the Lord, because the people say, "We want a king." So when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn son name was Joel, and his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned toward dishonest prophets, took bribes, and perverted justice. So there's a sense in which, if there are God-fearers amongst the people, if there are devout people who want to follow Yahweh, it makes sense for them to say, "Samuel, when you die, just like Joshua did, just like Moses did, just like the judges did, don't leave these clowns in charge. It was never supposed to be the system where like it was passed down in a hereditary sense, but they're certain they don't want that to happen. So this is what they say. They say, give us, verse 6, a king to judge us. And Samuel considered their demand wrong because, it had been outlawed. So he prayed to the Lord. The Lord told him, listen to the people, everything they say to you, because they're not rejecting you and they're your family, although they are doing that, but because they are rejecting me. They have rejected me as their king. And as I pointed out at the end of Judges, that had happened long ago. Israel had no king. People did whatever they wanted. It should have read, Yahweh was the people's king, and his law was in their mouth, and they meditated on it day and night. That's what it should have said, shouldn't it? But it didn't. Israel had no king. Everyone did what they wanted. And so God says, well, this is what we're going to do. You want a king. I can show you how terrible that is. Basically, you choose a king. Although God chooses Saul. Saul, who is the first king over all of Israel. But he's the sort of king the people are looking for. Okay, that's the point. When we read about him, he's young, he's athletic, he's handsome, he's tall. He's like all of the things that in the ancient world you'd have gone, yeah, that's the boy we want to be in charge. If anyone's going to be at the front of a battle, it's going to be the biggest guy, it's going to be the most intimidating guy, it's going to be the smartest guy and the most impressive guy. If we're going to have his face on our stamps, then let's have the best face we can have on the stamp. Yeah, that's the idea. So God chooses him, but he's the people's choice, if you like. He's the people's king. And Samuel's job is to go and to anoint him. And, things start out all right. Chapter 11, Saul helps in the same sort of pattern as we've seen in the Judges. There's a city that's under threat, and Saul says, right, I'm the king now. We're all going to get together and we're going to go and help our brothers in this place, in a place called Jabesh Gilead. The folks who are threatening to kill you all, we're going to defend you and we're going to kick them out. And that's what happens. And afterwards, Saul says something wonderful. He says, Saul said, today, no one will be executed this day, for today the Lord has provided deliverance in Israel. So he wins a victory, but he's not like instantly full of himself, saying, see, you've needed me all along. I was what was missing in Israel. You've needed me, and now I'm here, lucky you. He wins the victory and he says, good thing God's on our side, isn't it? But that's it. From this point on, he descends into madness. You pick someone and you put them above you because you think that they are better, and they will act like they were better, and they will be terrified of losing everything that you've put into their possession. Jesus warns in the parable of the sower that those who have riches will fall away because they're worried, because they're scared of losing all the wonderful things that they have. And you see that very much in the life of Saul, that he wants to rule in such a way to keep favour with people, to make decisions based on what he thinks the people want him to make, to do things, horrible things, to individuals and groups of individuals so that they can't undermine him or rob him of his authority, whether that's their plans or not. He just does not want that to be a possibility. So this person, the people's choice of king, is just an absolute shambles. And there's a little Easter egg if you want to see it. He's from the place where the detestable thing was done at the end of the book of Judges, you know, the thing that caused the civil war. He's from there. So it's a bit like, well, obviously he's not going to be the one to restore the fortunes. He's not going to be the one to bring unity and life amongst the people. But God has said in the middle of it, in the middle of his reign, he disobeys him in a severe way. And so he says to Saul, the throne is not going to pass from you to your son. Oh, Jonathan. Saul's son Jonathan is probably, maybe with the exception of Daniel, like the only person in Scripture who you can't really say anything negative about. He's amazing. He comes out with some amazing things. If you put yourself in his shoes, you just think, I would not act as he would act, but he's righteous, he's kind, he's just, he's a legend. But God says, no, Saul, the throne is not going to pass to your son, even though actually, from anything we can tell, he would be a wonderful king. It's going to go to someone else. And Samuel, who had anointed Saul king, is sent to go and anoint one of Jesse's children. And they parade out all of the children, from the tallest and the oldest and the strongest and the fittest to the least of them, as in to the one who's not impressive, whose face is definitely at that point not appropriate for putting on coins and banknotes and what have you. And it's David. We know King David, wrote loads of the Psalms and was described as a man after God's own heart, which we usually use as an expression. That's come to mean in how we use it in English, as in, oh, now there's someone who does godly things. But that's not actually what it means. A man after God's own heart, think about that as being standing in contrast to Saul, who is a king after the people's own heart. So that's the person they would choose, the tallest, the fittest, the strongest, the champion. Now David, a man after God's own heart, meaning someone who God is going to choose, because God doesn't look at the outward appearance. That's exactly what we're told when David is chosen, when everyone else has gone, I don't think there are any more kids. Well, there's that slacker, there is that one we've sent out into the fields to look after some of the sheep. But why would you ever consider him? Well, God's saying, I'm going to choose the lowliest amongst you, because that's what God looks upon. His meekness, his lowness, his humility, whether that's within someone or that's forced on someone by other people's viewpoints of them. Anyway, David, massive irony, even in his young self, in his small frame, small body, what does David do? He goes out and he defeats Goliath. He kills the giant, literally, who terrifies Saul and his army. He trusts in God. He says, well, how are we going to let this Philistine get away with blaspheming against our God? And he just wanders out into the battlefield and kills him, because he knows that's what's right. God is there. God will look after his own name, and if he does that through me, David is basically saying, then all the better. 1 Samuel then for a long time is this story of a really awkward period where David is the right expression, heir apparent? Like he is the crowned prince. He is the crown prince. He's waiting to ascend to the throne, but Saul is still in power, and Saul is terrified of David. Saul doesn't just think that David is going to inherit the throne when he dies. Saul thinks for some reason that David is going to take the throne from him, like the first opportunity that he gets. And so you have a lot of the stories of Saul hunting David, literally hunting him, sending out people, offering bounties to discover him. David's got to go and live in caves. He's got to go and live in the realm of the dead. He's got to leave Israel at some point and go and live amongst the Gentiles just to survive, because Saul has this bloodlust for him. He wants to kill David, who might have some sort of inclination to steal or snatch his throne off him, which is where loads of the Psalms come out of. And when the Psalms are crying out so often about people who are persecuting me, people who are wanting to take my life, people who are treating me badly, people who are saying awful things about me, they're from so many of David's experiences in this portion of his life before he's become a king, and when he's literally on the run, when he's in hiding for his life. And it's just amazing to think that he learns so much about God in that period, isn't it? That we have the Psalms that he wrote, which we can use to learn about God, to reflect on who God is. And that comes from David's just horrible period of his life. Some of them come from a later period in his life. So Saul and Jonathan both die in battle. There's a little bit of to-ing and fro-ing between other people who think that they should be king instead. Ultimately, David becomes king, reunifies all of Israel together, moves the capital to Jerusalem, brings the ark and the tabernacle to Jerusalem as well. It's going to be like the centre of everything, spiritual life, civil life, the whole kit and caboodle. Later in his life, we know David has a real fall of his own when he sleeps with Bathsheba, gets her pregnant, conspires to have her husband murdered. Their son then dies. It's a low point. He thinks that he's hidden it, but Nathan the prophet brings it to him and he's convicted. Psalm 51 comes out of David's realization of that. But David's own family life is just a mess. Some real sickening stuff like there is in the book of Judges, of what they do to one another, that no matter, well, how good the king is, although there's plenty of question marks over how good a king David was because of the flaws that we see, because of the sins that we see in his life, that's no guarantee for everyone around, you know. It's our hope that if we're godly parents or grandparents that we'll have an influence on our families. There's no guarantee of that. It's our hope that if, you know, we're godly leaders in the church, then we'll have an influence. There's no guarantee on that. There's the hope that if we are a holy people, a righteous people, a just people here in Ammanford or the various places that we live and work, that'll have an impact. There's no guarantee that it will. It can do. David's story kind of reveals to us that it doesn't necessarily mean that. So some of the Psalms are actually written out from that latter period of life where he is king, but again, one of his children wants to shortcut the process and wants to inherit the throne now, sooner rather than later, Absalom. And so David is run out of town again. And it's tragic. It actually, I feel a little bit like I could cry speaking about it now. Because Absalom dies, and there's a sense like going through the story where you might say the soldiers around David say, this is a great day, you know, your enemy has been defeated, and David's just weeping, he's just heartbroken because his son is dead, and he hates that all of it has happened. It's horrible. Anyway, the kingship comes. In one sense, David is like, it'll never get better than this. But actually it does, because after David comes Solomon. So if you skip in your Bibles, we've just chatted through the story of 1 and 2 Samuel. If you skip through to 1 and 2 Kings or 1 and 2 Chronicles, these are the history, the story of what happens in Israel in the north and in the south. More about that next session. Under the various kings that come after David. And the next proper king is David's son Solomon. And we see actually this is the high point. And there are certain things that happen in the life and the rule and the reign of Solomon that make you think the story doesn't need to develop anymore. It's done. It's finished. This is it. So Solomon becomes king. Later on, Solomon is going to be involved in building the temple. So no longer this temporary structure where the people will be moving around and they carry, or God moves around with them and leads them. No, they're planted. They're in the place. I think I made a note of this. Chapter 4, verse 21 says this about Solomon's rule, that he ruled all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and as far as the border of Egypt. Everyone offered tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. It's a similar geographical area to what we saw in Joshua chapter 1. A little bit further down it says that he had dominion over everything west of the Euphrates River, from Tippashash to Gaza, and over all the kings even west of the Euphrates. He had peace on all his surrounding borders. It's like, it's done. It's sorted. Even in David's reign there was loads of fighting, but now here's Solomon, he's king, they've got it all, there's peace. Even where there are non-Israelite people, they are like happily submitting to him as king, to God as king as well. In the story, he builds the temple or oversees the building of the temple. God's presence is there wonderfully on day one. His glory fills the temple in such a way that the people can't even use it to begin with. There are stories here of just like what life is like in Solomon's Israel, where there's gold in abundance, there's food in abundance, there's spice in abundance, there's these descriptions of wood and other materials, and it's all quite reminiscent of the garden. So if you remember Genesis chapter 2, which to us just seems really odd, that loads of precious stones are mentioned, and the trees are mentioned, and the fruits are mentioned, and all of these sorts of things, and Solomon's reign, from this border to that border, just as God promised, and peace throughout the land, and everyone submitting to him, and all this wealth and prosperity. And you just think, it cannot get any better than this. And then you think, maybe one of the most famous things about Solomon, when God comes to him and says, look, you are going to be king over these people. Now I will give you whatever you want. This is what Solomon answers when God says, what is it that you want? He says, Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father's David's place. Yet I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. Your servant is among your people. You have chosen a people too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? He doesn't ask anything for himself, really, although he's asking for wisdom. He's asking for something for the good of the people. He does not see himself as being up to the task. Hello, this is interesting. I've only just noticed this. in all my years of being a Christian. So, the problem with eating the fruit in the garden, God said don't eat of that fruit, so the problem is you're disobeying God, but it's the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, isn't it? And you can essentially reason through the scriptures that God wants Adam and Eve, he wants people to know good and evil, but for them to come to him for that knowledge. Instead, they grasp it themselves. The serpent says, you know why God doesn't want you to have that? Because he doesn't want you to know what good and evil is. So if you're going to know, if you're going to have wisdom, you've got to take it for yourself. That's what happens in the garden. Here's someone who says, I want to know God, what good and evil is. I need to know that. And I'm coming to you for it. That's amazing. Oh, well, it is definitely the crescendo. It's definitely the high point. You've got this godly, submissive ruler. They're enjoying the full benefits of everything that God has promised them when they're in this place. It's like a little heaven on earth. Sidebar, I think that geographical Israel is what geographical Eden was. So they're there and they're enjoying it. But I've got there crescendo and come down, because if we know two things about Solomon, number one, it's that he has an amazing amount of wisdom, which is why he wrote a tremendous amount of Proverbs, or why people wrote in the pseudonym of Solomon a tremendous amount of wisdom stuff, because to speak wisdom was to be Solomon-esque. So you have Song of Solomon, you have Ecclesiastes, you have massive swathes of the book of Proverbs that weren't written by Solomon, but that are trying to be like, the wise one. So we know that he is wise. God gave him wisdom unlike any wisdom that was ever seen before or after. But we also probably know that he was, anybody? What else do we know about Solomon?
He liked sex too much.
He had lots of wives.
He had lots of wives. Now they're
And
concubines, yes.
So it's not just wives.
So there's lots of ways of slicing this, and it's not just lots. The numbers are in the thousands. It's insane. And yeah, there's a sensuality to it. There's clearly a total rejection of how God has instructed us to relate to one another and to use our bodies. There's suggestions as well that there's a lot of political work going on there, that an enemy is not going to attack and destroy you and your palace and your stronghold if they know their own children are there and their own grandchildren are there. So there's like political allies being made through marriages and so on, which again is a rejection of God, because you're trusting in those processes rather than trusting in God. And so Solomon's life and legacy really isn't the abundance, but it's the confusion, and it's the muddiness that comes through the failure of all these women, of all these treaties, of all the compromise that actually came in through his life. And this is where we're going to be going in the next section. Section 4 is the rejection of God, the split in the kingdom, the exile into Babylon, which we were looking at when we did Ezra Nehemiah in home groups the other day. But after Solomon, the kingdom is split. Sorry, I was just going to say the kingdom is split. There isn't that nice succession from David to Solomon to the next, but there are fightings, there are wranglings, and things are literally never the same again after that. So it's the crescendo, it's the high point, but it's also the beginning of the end, really, and it's the start of a massive downward spiral which we're going to see next session ends up in exile. David?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to clarify because I said about Solomon and women and sex and that Song of Solomon is a book that's also from God, and it's about the gifts of sexuality, and it's a very beautiful book, the way God intends it. So it's not that alone, but it was Solomon. He went so big and large on women. They led him to reject God, didn't they? So in the end, it was he started to worship other gods. He basically started to. He had so many different women, and they were not. They didn't follow Yahweh. So wasn't his worship of his idolatry that led to the fall and the whole thing collapsed? Because it's that same commandment throughout Judges. When the meaning of the word evil, doing evil in the sight of God, is not obeying that first command, from which everything else falls apart. That first command, you shall have no other gods but me. Isn't that where Solomon?
Yeah.
The relationship with the women, he would go with their gods rather than say no.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the continued warning as much as it is when God outlaws stuff in Scripture, it's as much prohibiting those things as warning against them and saying if you go down this path, it doesn't end well. So you go down this path, marrying the women from the other nations and what have you, and you will be led astray to worship their gods. And that is exactly what plays out time and time again in all of the stories. It's almost as if God knows what he's talking about. But we don't credit him for it. We always think our version of events will lead it to a happier, fuller, more abundant life. And it is not the way. Death breeds death. Unless it's Jesus' death, and then that breeds life. And that is, again, what is so amazing about the cross. I have really skipped ahead. It's hard not to, isn't it? Okay, well, I appreciate, again, we've covered a lot of ground, or I hope we've covered a lot of ground. Actually, we've covered about 4 centuries of the history, from Joshua and all of the judges and all of that, to Samuel anointing Saul and David, and then to Solomon. And there's a couple of centuries left to go until the exile and the return from exile. But yeah, we're moving on. I hope that's helpful, and it puts a couple of events that maybe you knew about already into the chronological context that they are in, and it will help you sort of link people and ideas and events together so that you start to see. The whole point is that when Jesus arrives, none of it is out of the blue. I can't remember if we spoke about this in the first session, but all of the Gospels that we've got, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, sort of assume that we know everything that's gone before. You need, for Jesus to be who he is, Jesus never said he was God, or Jesus never claimed to do this. Well, not in the words that we would choose, but coming out of this, it's exactly what he said, who he was and what he was going to do and what everyone was expecting him to do. So all of this, I think, is helping us, preparing us, that when we come to Jesus, we're like, now I see who you are. Now I see what you are doing. Now I see what you have achieved. Now I see how it all fits together. That's the point of this course, to try and help us to see how it all fits together. So would somebody pray? And then we'll head off into the night. I think this is the latest I've kept you. I apologise. But it's because you all wanted to talk about Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 to 9. Somebody pray for us?